everyone. We're delighted to see so many people here that came out, braved the cold and rainy weather to join us today to talk about a really important topic. It's really a pleasure to be joined today by Ramnath, Subbaraman, and Subhadra Banda. Ramnath is, in addition to being an associate physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital, he's also a research advisor to the Partners for Urban Knowledge, Action, and Research, PUKAR. He received his medical training at Yale Medical School. He did his residency at UCSF. He was a Fogarty Fellow with PUKAR and actually spent several years leading their slum health project. And if you've ever Googled him, you will see a very impressive list of publications and fantastic work that he's doing. And Subhadra is currently, thankfully for us, a master's candidate at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, but she comes with experience having worked at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi, a premier think tank there, working on a project called the Cities of Delhi. And she received her law degree from the National Academy of Legal Science and Research and was a judicial clerk at the Supreme Court of India, and also has experience working at the Ford Foundation. And I suppose I should introduce myself as well. I'm Sharmila Murthy. I'm an assistant professor of law at Suffolk University Law School in downtown Boston, and also a visiting scholar at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government with the Sustainability Science Program. And my background, my training is from Harvard Law School, Harvard Kennedy School, and much of my writing is on access to water and sanitation, in particular from a human rights perspective. So our plan today was to spend about an hour having a conversation amongst ourselves around 6 topics. So first is, let's put the topic of sanitation in a global context. It is a women's issue, but it's also an issue that affects the broader population. We really want to contextualize that. Then we're going to be talking about the public health implications, a short case study of Delhi, what it's like to live without access to adequate toilets. Then thinking about what are the implications when you don't have water, and what are those impacts on sanitation. Finally, taking a step back and looking at some of the various policy schemes before thinking about what are really the challenges on the ground of implementing them in urban slums. And then finally, we're hoping to open it up and have a nice Q&A, and I know many of you have experiences in this topic or an interest, and we're interested in hearing your thoughts as well. So to begin, it's helpful to put India in the global context. The Millennium Development Goals, many of you will know, were global commitments to end poverty, one of which was having the number of people by 2015 without access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation. And I want to first share some of those statistics, because I think it's important to put India's progress in that global context. So first is, there are certainly challenges with the way that access to sanitation is measured, but the standard internationally is what an improved sanitation facility is. You could see a flush pour system, pit latrine, etc. And then there's a whole ladder of different kinds of what is considered unimproved sanitation, with the worst being open defecation. If you look, India is approximately 1/3 of all of the people in the world who do not have access to improved sanitation live in India. And India has certainly made progress, but compared to other countries, and certainly compared to, for a country that is set to be an Asian tiger, really trying to play a huge role on the international scene, certainly that progress has not been enough. If you look at the countries that are not on track to meet this target in 2015, we see that India is certainly not on track. More than half of the people in the world who defecate in the open live in India. And more specifically, a huge part of this challenge is in the rural areas. Only about 25% of Indian villagers have access to what is considered an improved source of sanitation. And what's interesting is some of you may that are familiar with this topic may recall that a couple years ago, the census had pointed out that only 30% of Indians had access to sanitation compared to, in rural areas, compared to a figure that India's Total Sanitation Campaign, one of its big policy flagship programs, had reported it at 80% because of self-reporting. And then I was interested to see that these stats from the WHO and UNICEF, which make up the Joint Monitoring Program, put it at only 25%. Now, in urban areas, the situation is slightly better, significantly better according to these statistics, right? 60% of people have access to improved sanitation. That still leaves a big number of people, though, without it. And as a paper that Ramnath authored demonstrates, we have to cast a careful eye at these statistics, because in many instances, slum dwellers are not counted within official statistics. And if you actually look right here, you'll see that according to India's own statistics, 21.4% of slum dwellers were determined to have access to a non-shared toilet, i.e. a private toilet. But in reality, in their survey of a non-notified slum that Ramnath will be talking about more, only 3%. So I think that that's important when we're looking at these statistics to have that grain of salt. So when I was in Mumbai about a year and a half ago, meeting with the additional municipal commissioner to understand some of the challenges of extending access to water and sanitation in the slums, it was interesting to walk by a sign like this and realize that for many people, a human function, what we need to do on a daily basis that makes us human, can essentially be penalized. Because if you don't have a safe place, an appropriate place to be using a toilet, you could in fact be fined. I think one of the things is now India, a lot of global attention has been focused on this question of sanitation. Not only because India is off track to meeting the Millennium Development Goals, but as many of you know, the international community in 2015 is set to adopt these Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 6 is about ensuring water and sanitation for all. What's important here is that it's not only about having the number of people, but trying to get it for all, that we're talking about sanitation and hygiene. Because in thinking about this as a women's issue, we know that menstrual hygiene is another taboo topic that's even harder to talk about than toilets. And in here it mentions paying attention to the needs of women and girls. I was interested to see the latest draft and realized that an earlier draft this summer actually had in it language about ensuring that there would also be facilities at homes, schools, health centers, and refugee camps. And that language is actually no longer in the latest draft. And that's important because we know that lack of access to adequate sanitation, to adequate hygiene, menstrual hygiene, materials, girls do not go to school. That women spend significant amounts of time waiting to relieve their bladders, to actually have to wait until the cover of darkness to go to relieve themselves outside. And of course, who can forget the news this summer? We woke up, we heard of this really tragic story of 2 young girls having been found murdered, hung by their dupattas from a mango tree. And so the press was full of news articles that pointed out that it was the fact that they had gone outside at night to relieve themselves that had made them vulnerable. But one of the things that I think is important to point out is that I think it's critical that we are focusing on this question of hygiene and sanitation. And it is frankly a shame that it took such a tragic incident for us to really focus attention on it. But I think that the reality is that the issue of gender violence is an incredibly complicated issue, that it involves caste issues as well, much larger issues, and that I think those who have argued that just toilets alone is not going to solve the issue of gender violence, I would agree with that. I think that we should still be thinking, though, about access to sanitation and hygiene, because it does have a disproportionate impact on women. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague Ramnath. Having just sort of tried to situate India within a global context, Ramnath, given your experience as a physician, public health expert, what are really the public health implications of lack of access to sanitation?
So thanks, Sharmila, for inviting me here to talk about this. I'm by no means an expert on sanitation, public health. I do a lot of work on water, but there's a lot of overlap. And so what I'm going to try and do quickly is hit on the big picture points that help us understand the connection between sanitation and health outcomes. So I want to start with two foundational issues. They say death and taxes are inescapable. And well, in India, death and malnutrition seem to be inescapable for children in relation to sanitation. So over the last 10 years, there was a study called the Million Death Study, which basically aims to do 1 million verbal autopsies on deaths in India to get sort of the best epidemiologic information we have on why people die. And if you look at that study, for children between 1 to 5 years of age, about 22% of deaths are due to diarrhea, and 28% of deaths are due to pneumonia. And I include pneumonia here because it's partially water preventable. Hand hygiene can cause dramatic reductions in rates of pneumonia in children. So both of them are water, sanitation, and hygiene related. And for children who are between 5 and 14 years of age, who are generally thought to be at substantially lower risk of dying of diarrhea, there's still a substantial proportion of deaths that are due to diarrhea and pneumonia. And in fact, 50% of all deaths in children between 5 and 14 years of age in the Million Death Study were attributable to infectious causes, many of which are water, sanitation, and hygiene preventable. And water, sanitation, and hygiene become even more salient when you talk about the nutrition gap in India. So if you look at India, which has a population that's equivalent to that of all of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, and if you look at the proportion of children who are underweight, for some indicators, it's nearly twice that of sub-Saharan Africa. And this despite having, compared to most sub-Saharan African countries, a much higher GDP per capita. And part of the argument here is that a substantial part of this malnutrition is secondary to substantially worse sanitation access in India. And just to give you, and so this slide, which is from old data from UNICEF, the gap has only grown bigger to my understanding actually. You can see for underweight, stunting, and wasting, which are the three primary sort of indicators of nutrition we look at in large-scale surveys, India is substantially lower than sub-Saharan Africa for all of them. And if you look at sort of the scientific basis of the argument that diarrhea leads to malnutrition, it's fairly rigorous. So in the 1970s in Guatemala, Leonardo Mata actually mapped hundreds of growth charts for children and mapped them in relation to disease. And I just love this chart because it's just so meticulous. If you look at the line on top, the sort of dashed line, that's a normal growth for a child. And if you look at the line that's sort of staggering up and down, that's the growth in one of the children who he monitored. And the D represents diarrheal illness. And if you look closely at every D, there's a drop in weight for the child. And the cumulative effect of those recurrent episodes of diarrhea basically leads to sort of cumulative malnutrition, which is essentially irreversible at a certain point, especially within the first 3 years of life. And so those findings, as well as findings from many cohort studies, so for example, Richard Guerrant and colleagues, who's sort of one of the gurus of tropical medicine, followed 308 Brazilian children in a shanty town and found that those who had 9 episodes of diarrhea compared to those who didn't in the first 2 years of life, at age 7 were 4 centimeters shorter on average. And those who also had worm infection on top of that were 8 centimeters shorter. Again, sort of the relationship between malnutrition and diarrheal illness. And in the last sort of 2 decades, there's been a hypothesis that recurrent diarrhea and some chronic diarrheal infections, such as cryptosporidium, lead to a malnourished gut. So the gut itself becomes chronically damaged and unable to absorb. So if you look at the bottom right slide that says malnourished infected, what you see is the fingers of what we call the villi, the fingers of the gastrointestinal tract have basically been destroyed, and so there's what we call a chronic enteropathy. There's an inability to absorb as well. And so recurrent diarrheal illness related to sanitation causes this sort of chronic problem. So knowing all that, it's not surprising to see findings such as these from the Hungama study which looked at defecation in open defecation in 112 districts in India. And this analysis of those data by Dean Spears and colleagues showed that if you look at the x-axis, which is open defecation, and the y-axis is child stunting, and each circle is a district, that there's a substantial association between open defecation and childhood stunting. And after they controlled that for various covariates, there was still about 30 to 50% of malnutrition that was, in their analysis, attributable to diarrheal illness and open defecation in particular. That's substantial, any way you look at it. I mean, that's huge. And I think that this sort of backs up. I think it may overestimate it just because there are a lot of things you can't get in these surveys that may contribute to malnutrition that they couldn't control for. But, you know, a substantial proportion of malnutrition is related to this. So I'm going to quickly cover two final studies that came out this year, which are sort of the gold standard public health evidence that we look at, and they're kind of depressing. So they're randomized trials looking at India's total sanitation campaign. One was by Sumit Patel and colleagues and looked at 40 intervention and 40 control villages in Madhya Pradesh. And the intervention villages had where they instituted subsidies for toilet construction, social mobilization for behavior change, awards for open defecation-free villages. There was a 19% greater increase in individual home latrine construction. There was a 10% reduction in open defecation. These are small. And you saw no improvement in child diarrheal illness, swarm infections, or growth. Multiple markers that they looked at. And what's notable is that there wasn't a big impact of pretty substantial intervention. There was 84% open defecation in the control group and 73% in the intervention group. So there's not, you know, they tried a lot and you still couldn't sort of cause massive reduction in open defecation. Thomas Playson and colleagues, similarly, very similar trial in Odisha where they looked at 50 intervention villages and 50 control villages. They had a much more substantial increase in latrine coverage from 9% to 63% as compared to only 8 to 12% in controlled villages. But there was, again, no improvement in child mortality, diarrhea, or nutrition. So that begs the question, why aren't we seeing health gains? I mean, part of it is because the interventions didn't work very well. Despite a lot of efforts and extensive efforts into trying to get people to build latrines and use them, they just fell short in causing substantial latrine coverage, and especially latrine use. And now the focus has really shifted, and this has been known for several years, but a lot of good data have come out on this point, that there's underutilization of toilets. So even households that have a latrine in rural areas are underutilizing them, especially among men, but also among women. And this study, which came out in Economic and Political Weekly by Diana Coffey and colleagues, sort of brings home this point. So the black is the 55% of people who don't have a toilet and open defecate. The remainder are those who do have a toilet. And of those, about 40% of those with a toilet in sort of the white or gray wedge are underutilizing the toilet. They have at least one household member who isn't using the latrine. And what's interesting is there's sort of an age-related association with open defecation use, such that women and men at the age of 20 are the ones who are most likely to be using toilets, and that increases with age. You could look at this in one of two ways. One is that that maybe people are getting used to using latrines. And so the younger people are now just getting into the habit of using latrines and the older people haven't. One hopes that's the case, but that may or may not be it may be that people slowly, as they age, stop using latrines. That's another interpretation. So either way, I think there are two big points here. One is that underutilization is a big issue in rural areas. And I think that's in big contrast to urban areas where I think there is substantial demand for toilets in the urban sector. And sort of a good transition to your...
Yeah, so we've had an opportunity to situate India in the global context, thought a little bit about the public health impacts, and in particular, why eliminating open defecation in an entire community is important. And now Subhadra is going to try and share with us some insights from her work in Delhi.
Thanks, Sharmila, for having me on the panel first, and also for the question. So the project that you were talking about, the Cities of Delhi project, looks at 14 different settlements in Delhi, all unplanned, and looks at their access to services and how they negotiate for it. And the services being water, electricity, solid waste management and sanitation. So, I mean, about your question, whether, how large is the issue really, I thought it would be great if I take you through the case study of one particular slum, and I chose Indira Kalyan Vihar. So, Delhi has 8 different types of settlements, 7 of which are unplanned. 67% of the city, as per Delhi's own estimates, is in that unplanned range. So that makes me wonder whether that should be called the planned bit or the unplanned bit. But going back to this, so Jhuggi Jhopdi clusters are at the bottom of that category, and they are essentially non-notified slums, similar to what Ramnath will be addressing later. And the population of this particular slum is 120,000 people. So it's one of the largest Jhuggi Jhopdi clusters there are, about 18,000 voters amongst them. And the first time this settlement got a community toilet was in 1988 when Sulabh Shauchalaya was set up. As some of you know, these are community toilets that are set up by an organization called Sulabh International. And unfortunately, in the early 90s, this particular toilet that was set up in Indira Kalyan Vihar stopped being functional. Then in 2002, 2 more toilet complexes were set up under various schemes, including the Yamuna Action Plan. And amongst those, one stopped functioning. Amongst the ones that function, there are 3 functional seats. So I forgot to mention, the settlement is sort of built around this drain that you can see and plays a huge role in the toilet situation. So the functional toilet complex that I'm talking about is run by a private contractor, and this element of ownership and maintenance is something that I'll talk about later, but I just want to flag that. And then there are, amongst those functional seats, even it's problematic because there are insects and worms all over, and that, as the residents told us, it has a huge impact on the number of people using them. These toilets do have user charges, and you can say that a family of 5 spends around 15 to 20 rupees per day on toilet usage. That is a notable fraction of family income. And because of this poor public provisioning, what always happens has happened. That is, private provisioning has come up, Jugaad, as the last seminar spoke about. And here in this case, it is that a lot of the more well-off residents have built individual toilets within their households. Many of them use cesspits, and a lot of them actually just drain straight into the drain. And you can see that there are outlets you can see along the drain. Those are outlets for those toilets. The other thing that we found that was very specific to this slum was this sort of porter cabin that they've created, which is an open-air toilet with tarpaulin walls. And these are about 15 to 20 households within the slum, which have again built it on one side of the slum close to the drain. The other thing we noticed was that this is actually one of the, we didn't notice this in any of the other slums that we are looking at, but there is this situation of flying toilets. They're common in countries like Nigeria, where people defecate or urinate into a plastic bag and then throw them somewhere. And in this case, it's the drain that you saw, which hosts these plastic bags. So the question then comes to mind, which is, why aren't there new toilets being built? Of course, we don't know whether new toilets are being built, but there are constantly foundation stones for those new toilets that you'll see everywhere. So in April 2013, when we first visited Indira Kalyan Vihar, we saw a foundation stone with 3 non-profits on that foundation stone, and of course the MLA's name. In July 2013, when we visited, there was no foundation stone there. In October 2013, 2 months prior to the Delhi election, true to all the literature that says that service provisioning is, spurred by elections, 2 sets of toilet complexes were constructed, and of course the MLA's name was on both of those stones. Latest on that is that I went back in May 2014, and they're done. The toilets are built, but they're not open for use. So, about going back to the point about whether it's how large is this issue, I thought, I'm a lawyer, so I just went straight to case law, and I wonder what the court thinks about this, because that, as as you might already know, the court and the Supreme Court in specific plays a large role in policy in India. And it's interesting because in the 80s, in 1980, Justice Krishna Iyer, who turned 100 2 days ago, recognizes that open defecation is largely a problem that has arisen because of the lack of infrastructure provided by municipalities. And then goes on to give a very progressive order where he asks the municipality, directs them to build infrastructure to curb this problem. And there is no doubt that there is this behavioral aspect to it, but what the Delhi High Court then goes on to do surprises me, because the framing shifts. So they are no longer looking at this as a problem that has been compounded by the lack of infrastructure, but this framing also shifts alongside the framing in other planning instruments, which start looking at Delhi as this world-class city. And therefore, there's this great piece by Asher Gertner on this, and he traces this transition where he says that a lot of the cases start looking at slums as if they were an affront to urban order, and those kinds of framing happen. But the most surprising to me was this judgment in the case of the Pitampura Sudhar Committee in 2002, where the Delhi High Court places the rights of the neighbors of slums that witness this nuisance that is open defecation against the rights of the residents of the slums, and says that upholds the right to life of the residents in these neighboring colonies, and says you can't sacrifice that on the basis of, in the name of social justice to the residents of the slum dwellers. So this change I thought was fairly interesting. And with that, we can transition.
So before we move on, let's just come back to the gender dimension, because we've now thought about the public health implications, in particular on children, thinking about what it's like to live without adequate sanitation. But at least anecdotally, Ramnath, in your work, have you found that the impact from a public health standpoint on women as caregivers or young girls, there's any impact due to lack of sanitation?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that recurrent diarrheal disease has a huge impact on women, their household duties, taking care of children. As I'll talk about, some other things because diarrhea is a more episodic event, the costs are substantial. We actually did a study of the household costs of diarrheal illness. PUKAR did a study, the organization that I worked with, along with some other colleagues here in the medical school. And the costs at that acute event are very substantial. The time on women is very substantial. And a lot of the costs were actually attributable to time women don't spend finishing household chores, even if they're not employed. For women who are employed, obviously it's a big issue.
And how about for you, Subhadra, in your work in the Cities of Delhi project, differences between the way in which men versus women experienced lack of sanitation?
No, I mean, it was clear that, in fact, it's interesting because our methodology itself will tell you about the problem. So we would visit during different times during the week, and during the weekday, we'd usually find women in the slum. And the first thing that they would mention as soon as you arrived there was they were wondering whether you were a non-profit. They're very curious about what you're going to do for them. But the first thing they would say is, are you going to be providing toilets for us? And I found that fairly interesting because that is the one service that they would mention throughout. In fact, it was interesting that it became an issue during the elections as well, which is clearly why you saw that service provisioning, that the MLA recognizes that this is a constituency I have to cater to. And therefore, this building of a toilet at least was this huge thing that he did. And you can see that this had an impact on people, that people were like, okay, he's at least building toilets now, and maybe I should vote for him now. So it's clear that this is a huge issue, and more substantially so for women. They are the primary constituency that does get affected by lack of sanitation.
Yeah, and the point about the MLAs, I think, is such a good one, because when I was speaking with a senior official in the BMC in Mumbai, had mentioned that the municipality wanted to be constructing community toilets, but oftentimes when they would actually find a site that was suitable for doing it, oftentimes the MLA would come in and say, no, I would like to be the one to lay the foundation stone to build the toilet, but then it wouldn't be constructed properly. It wouldn't be constructed with the proper water, with the proper maintenance, and so but the municipality, the bureaucrats weren't really in a position to be contradicting what the MLAs wanted. So if you don't mind. So from here, we've talked, we have talked about sanitation, but to this point of the critical role that lack of access to water has on the sanitation problem in an urban context. Would you mind sharing your experiences, Ramnath, on that?
So I think Sharmila sort of added this to humor me, because this is sort of the work that I do. Is a lot of it is on water scarcity in Mumbai. This is the settlement where PUKAR, the organization that I work with, that we've been studying for the last now 5-6 years. It's Banda. It's a community on a wharf, about 14,000 people wedged onto a very tiny space. The density is 6 times that of daytime Manhattan. So we're talking about a very dense slum settlement. This just shows one of the ways in which people get water. Some households, about 1/3 of households, get water by rolling it rolling a big drum to a tap outside of the community. There are also a lot of informal water distributors who actually have a lot of hoses and other contraptions to facilitate getting water to people's homes. But in sort of talking about this and then eventually relating it back to sanitation, one of the things I wanted to do is sort of put water poverty in Mumbai in context. So our findings in Banda and sort of a couple of studies have found that people on average use about 23 liters per person per day of water, or that's what they have access to and consume. I just want to poll the audience and see how many of you think that 23 liters sounds like a good quantity of water for use in a day. You can sort of raise your hands and So how many of you think it's not a good quantity or not enough water? Okay, so how many liters, and I'm going to sort of put out some numbers, do you think that the average American uses per day? And I'm going to put out some categories here. 25 to 50 liters per person per day. How much do you think you use? 50 to 150 liters. Okay. 150 to 300 liters. And greater than 300 liters. Is anyone?
Just because
no one's going. Yeah. So we, on average, from the EPA website this morning, the average American uses 379 liters per capita per day of water. Right. About 25% is flushing the toilet. So that gives you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about, 23 liters per capita per day versus about 380 liters per person per day. And the reason I bring this up is because whenever anyone talks about water poverty, the obsession is with drinking water and with safe water. And I think that's partially very important, and it's partially it falls short of what's really, really important. The implication with saying drinking water is safe water is that getting everyone 1 to 4 liters of microbiologically safe drinking water is the only important challenge that we face. And based on this premise, there are any number of social entrepreneurial groups, private organizations that are literally selling liters of water in slum settlements in India, claiming they're doing a great public service, and charging rates that are exorbitantly higher than the municipal rate. There are any number of organizations selling filters. And I think I want to challenge that issue in a couple of ways really quickly. The first is that in cities, I would argue contamination is less important than we generally conceive it to be, partially because there are centrally chlorinated water supplies. And even people who are stealing them from centrally chlorinated supplies. There are that's a much more complex discussion. There's still contamination that can happen. It's unclear how much that contributes to disease. The second thing I want to say is the bigger conceptual failure with focusing on drinking water alone, especially in urban settlements, is that we don't recognize the catastrophic consequences of not having enough water, which is really, if you spend 5 minutes going into any slum settlement, the immediate thing that people will talk to you about. partially because they don't recognize whether their water is contaminated or not, but partially because that's really what matters to them. And so when you think about how much water a person needs, this is sort of one schematic. If you think, say, drinking, you need 5 liters, which is probably more than you need for drinking. Bathing is 15 liters. Cooking and washing is 10 liters, which is really, pretty low. And sanitation is 20 liters. A reasonable minimum would be about 50 liters per person per day. And WHO says sort of average adequate water service delivery in sort of a developing country, at least 50 liters is a good ballpark. And anyone who's getting less than 20 liters per capita per day is at high or very high risk to human health. And in fact, studies bear this out. Quantity is arguably as or more important than quality of water with regard to disease. And we could go into more about why that is. So just to go through how much water people get in Gulab under the slum settlement that we study, about 80 to 95% of people use less than that 50-liter threshold, and about 40 to 50% at different seasons of the year use less than 20 liters per capita per day. So what would be, the WHO would say, would be sort of what I would call severe poverty and very high risk to human health. And the cost of water is anywhere from 52 to 206 times the municipal rate, the municipal charge for water. And this is because in the process of having to steal water, informal water distributors add on charges, and partially because the equipment costs a lot to them, and partially because they get raided by the government and have to pay bribes to get motors back. And these costs add up, and in summer, for example, people are paying 17% of their income just to buy water. I'm just going to run through a few quick quotes. This is one that I think touches on that issue of inadequate quantity. So this woman says, who's a 30-year-old Hindu woman from Tamil Nadu, as I've denoted her, suppose that water doesn't come for 10 days. After 5 days, we begin to run out of water and I can't complete any of my housework. During those times, my main preoccupation is wondering when water will come again. All of our clothes accumulate in the house, and because we can't wash them. If we had water, we could actually complete our daily household chores. During times when water doesn't come, I have a lot of tension. At some points, even cooking food becomes difficult. In the end, we always have to set aside some water to make sure we have enough to drink. Even if we aren't washing clothes, washing the dishes, or cooking, we have to make sure we have enough to drink. Water usually comes again after 1 week. If it doesn't come after a week, it's unbearable. This just brings home the number of uses of water and the sort of impact it has on the household, and especially on women. I'm going to, I don't know whether I have enough time, but we're probably running behind. I'm going to skip these two. Well, I'll do one of them. Sure. So this is an example of, I'll go to this one. So this is another example of the impact of quantity. This 35-year-old woman says, as I told you, I don't get enough water to clean my children. Every day I clean one of them with only 4 glasses of water each. For my mentally disabled child, I use more water because I'm concerned about his health. I don't bathe every day. If I don't clean my children every day, then how could they go to school? The other children at school tease them, but what can I do? It's a serious problem. Most of the time my body smells dirty, but I can't clean myself. Then I get frustrated. My children want to bathe in more water, but it's impossible, so they're irritated. Many children actually end up getting sent home from school because they smell. So this is, again, brings home the issue of quantity. Focusing on drinking water is a very, very narrow world view on this issue. This is how I conceptualize water after doing tons of interviews and a lot of quantitative work. It's ridiculous. but it brings home a few points. You really have to look at cost, access, reliability, quantity, equity, and quality when you're assessing whether people are meeting goals in terms of access to water. You can't just look at, is it clean? Because that addresses none of the quotations and none of the issues I just sort of posed to you. And the impacts on life, it sort of fans out to have impacts on employment, household economy, education, quality of life, social relationships, community cohesion, social integration with the rest of society, and health. Health being potentially the lowest on that list. So you really have to conceptualize water and its impacts in a very broad sense. And so bringing it back to sanitation, I think water is to some extent central to sanitation for poor flush latrines, for many forms of improved sanitation. Water is crucially important to maintaining it. Not for pit latrines. There are some that are relatively low water requirements. For the types of toilets people aspire to in India, which is part of the problem, because they aspire to something better than many other people have, water is really central. So.
Yeah, and I think, Ramnath, that your comments really, I think, number one, underscore the gender burden because both you're interviewing women who are responsible for those household chores, responsible for cleaning the children. I think the other thing that I might just comment is that in thinking about all of those dimensions of water, you know, internationally the world's begun talking about a human right to safe drinking water and sanitation, and part of that is about thinking about all of those dimensions. And when you think about what is the content of that right, it's really all those criteria that you mentioned. So we've had a bit of a window into really thinking about the challenges in an urban context. And, but in fact, as you recall from the first conversation, it's the rural side that has really been dominated the national government's efforts. And following up on this idea of just the health costs of water, there's a really interesting study that was done by the Water and Sanitation Program of the World Bank that talked about the impact, the economic impact of poor sanitation. And essentially they said in 2006, the economic impact of poor sanitation in terms of health impacts, tourism costs, costs in terms of having to buy treated water because their water was contaminated, and time spent trying to seek a safe place to defecate, all amounted to 6.4% of India's GDP. I mean, so beyond just thinking about this from the gender perspective, the human rights perspective, the public health impacts, there are significant economic impacts that result as well. Interestingly, this has been a huge issue that has attracted, some of you may recall a few years ago, Jairam Ramesh made a similar comment and attracted quite a lot of ire, but the new Prime Minister of India has now really embraced the idea of trying to make India defecation free, because how can India be a huge member of the international community with such a shame? And thinking about the rural scheme, so I really want to go through a little bit of alphabet soup of central government schemes. So for those of you that are familiar with Indian policies, you know that there is basically just a massive effort by the national government to try and impact things at the local level. And initially, sanitation was identified as a challenge in the mid-'80s with the Central Rural Sanitation Program. Then most of us are probably familiar with the Total Sanitation Campaign. It was really a campaign to end open defecation. It then became rebranded in 2012 as the Nirmal Bharat Abhiyan. And now Prime Minister Modi is launching his Swachh Bharat Abhiyan campaign. So he was seen sweeping in the streets, and the idea is that let's clean up India, let's put together solid waste management and keeping the city clean and putting sanitation as part of this. And mind you, we've been talking about toilet access. We haven't actually been talking about the fact that the vast majority of waste that is actually collected is simply untreated and just passes directly into the waterways. The other challenging part of trying to make impact on this is that, so we're thinking about at the national level, that you have multiple ministries that might be involved. So now the Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation is focused on this, but it was formerly part of the Ministry of Rural Development. Some key aspects. Historically, it was quite supply driven. Many of you may know that sort of in line with the way that we think about development now, it's all about demand driven, right? Trying to create demand for it, subsidies for construction of toilets if you're below the poverty line. But the challenge is that it's actually something that you recoup afterwards. People have to invest their finances up front, they have to invest their labor. That's actually reimbursed in part through a rural employment scheme. And a big piece of this is education and awareness. What's interesting is that as an incentive, the national government, so India is a federal country, has a national government, a state level government, and then in the early 1990s empowered the local level of government. So in the rural areas, the panchayats. And the panchayats are able to win an award and to receive some it's both recognition, you receive some financial compensation if you can assert that you are open defecation free, that everyone has access to sanitation. You've got, it sounds great, right? Like why not try to incentivize this? Well, the reality is this was a study by the ministry itself. Approximately 5% of those that attained this status were found to actually subsequently maintain their open defecation free status. And they went and they discovered, well, why is it that even once a village might go and become open defecation free and everybody's building a toilet, and you know, part of the way you get your reimbursement is you have to take your picture by your toilet and then you submit that along for your reimbursement. Things like unfinished, poor installations. We heard about that in the urban areas. It's happening in the rural areas as well. People are not accustomed to using it. People might be working in fields, or children are playing out in the fields. People also cited just behavior change. And then the challenges with what to do with the waste, right? I mean, that I think also fills, ideally you would have a 2-pit latrine, so when one is filled, it could be composting while the second one is being used. I mean, the rural challenge is in many ways quite different than the urban challenge, right? Because you actually, for the most part, would have space to actually leach out the sanitation, but it's largely about behavior change, because people do in fact are used to going in the field, and in fact some people also cited that it's a social activity, and people have said, you know, some of the backlash against the big all of the attention to women need toilets as a way of improving their health, improving their safety is, but women also might like the opportunity to get out of the house, to bond with their neighbors at night. So, you know, I mean, I don't have data on that, but this is one study that gives us some information. You then have things at the local level. I spent a couple of days with this great NGO down in Tamil Nadu near Trichy that's doing, you know, has like a toilet museum, and they do these national trainings. They're actually leading a toilet day in India later in November. They're doing things like trying to get children to be singing songs and doing games and things all about behavior change. And then as well, there's efforts around maybe we should be thinking about getting people access to capital, so that even if they might be able to get a hold of that subsidy later, people may not even have the upfront cost, so things like microfinance. Now, in urban areas, you have the National Urban Sanitation Policy, also now being subsumed into Swachh Bharat. But that's only part of the story. You've got another whole mission around urban renewal that's including the Rajiv Awas Yojana scheme, which was about improving slums. Modi is transforming this into the Smart Cities Initiative. Complicated because you have multiple ministries that can actually be working on these projects. But in many ways, the challenges in the urban areas is the density, the fact that you have land tenure challenges that Subhadra is going to be talking much more about, but also that India is a federal country. And I think this is a challenge in both urban and rural areas, but we're going to explore this a little bit more in urban areas, excuse me. So as I mentioned, it has 3 tiers of government. Technically, water and sanitation are state subjects under India's constitution. I've just been talking to you about national programs. It is through the states that the government needs to act. And in 1992, when India amended its constitution to give constitutional status to urban local bodies, rural local bodies, there was this idea that they could be delegated power, and it's really at that local level that change can happen. And there's all of this talk about the need for India to be more decentralized. The reality is you're in this catch-22 situation. Many rural and urban local bodies do not have the capacity to actually properly implement these schemes, to be doing things like siting toilets and understanding how to build this infrastructure. At the same time, states are going to be reluctant to devolve down that power unless the local bodies have the position to do it. And sometimes the funding from the central government is tied to implementing these reforms. So a really challenging situation. And what's interesting is India, people like to note, is the largest democracy in the world. It's a largest federal country in the world. It's also the most centralized federal country. So the U.S., we live in a federal country as well. India is comparatively much more centralized, fiscally, politically, and administratively. And that then creates problems when you're thinking about how do you create change at this very, very local issue. So with that, let me turn it over back to Subhadra and then Ramnath to talk about, back to urban areas, some of those, how these challenges manifest.
Like you pointed out, there are many challenges to service provisioning, and especially with respect to toilets, and those are legal, technical, financial. And I thought the best way to actually think about this is in terms of examples in Delhi of how these challenges play out. So, for example, we were talking about the Juggi Jhopri clusters earlier. The Juggi Jhopri clusters, like I said, are non-notified slums. So the planning violation in that situation is that these squatter settlements are set up on public land, which is land owned by central, state, and local agencies. Delhi is a unique situation where a lot of the land is owned by a central government agency. In this case, 55% of the land on which Juggi Jhopri clusters are on is owned by the Delhi Development Authority, which is one of the central landowning agencies, and this causes many problems. So we have many levels of government involved, as you said, and the water parastatal, that is the government body that provides water supply and sewerage services, is the Delhi Jal Board. And then you have the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, which is the slum redevelopment and rehabilitation agency. But because of this land situation, you have this situation in which the Delhi Jal Board can't actually put in any hard infrastructure unless they have a no objection certificate from this landowning agency. And this actually never happens in practice because no landowning agency believes anything apart from that they're any moment now going to reclaim the land. It's a different situation that there are enough studies to say that when they do reclaim this land, it lies vacant for years. But in any case, the power to reclaim is something that they want to hold on to, and they think that it's problematic to put hard infrastructure in that place because then it's difficult to uproot it. There's a lot of money spent in putting that in, and that would be a wasted expenditure. So now moving to a different type of settlement, which is the resettlement colony. So I don't know why it's put under the categories of unplanned settlements, because this is a settlement type that has been built by the state in promising inner city residents of slums a better life, in that better services, etc., but in peripheral parts of Delhi, and peripheral to the point where they're almost in a different state. But going to this settlement type, it's interesting that you have the master plan of Delhi, which is a legal instrument as well, that says that, well, back in 2007, when the last wave of resettlement occurred, and they resettled inner city residents to these two big resettlement colonies called Bhavana and Savdagera. And the promise then was that within 2 years, the most urgent thing to do was to provide individualized services to water and sanitation. And till date, no surprise that hasn't happened. But why this hasn't happened is very interesting, and two conversations, one with the CEO of the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, which puts this in place, and the second conversation with the CEO of the Delhi Jal Board sort of tells you how big a problem this is. So when we met with the CEO of the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, it was interesting. He said, we'll first put the people there and then the services will follow. And he said, look, I mean, we have these resettlement colonies that we resettled in the 70s, and by the 90s they had water. And I said, okay. We continued the conversation, and then I had this conversation with the Delhi Jal Board CEO, and she had a very interesting perspective. She said that none of these agencies that build these resettlement colonies, and it's interesting that the agencies can range from the Delhi Development Authority, which is a central agency, to the DUSIB, which is a state level agency, to the Delhi Small Scale Industries Development Corporation, and we don't know why that's involved in any construction for a resettlement colony, but it is, does not go to the Delhi Jal Board for permissions prior to building these. So after the construction is done, and true to what the CEO said, that we don't believe that we should put the services in place and then take the people there. They put the people there, and then they realize that they need to go back and get permissions to put in individualized connections. And she has a very simple point. you resettle this entire bunch of people, like thousands of people, to a location that has no close trunk sewer line. How am I supposed to provide connections to these people? The other thing she says is also very interesting. She says that there's no gradient for you to be able to drain back any of the sewage. So this is technically not feasible. She says, I do want to provide services to everyone within the jurisdiction of the Delhi Jal Board, but I can't do it. Of course, the biggest problem plaguing us at this moment is that we don't know who owns what toilet, and we don't know who maintains it. And this is, I thought, like a personal dilemma. I mean, my boss used to ask me to go find out who are the agencies involved in maintaining these toilets, and I would come back with like an absolute confusion. And then I looked at case law and then realized I'm not that crazy, because neither does the MCD. So in 2002, the MCD gets pulled up for this contract that they signed with Sulabh International, giving them all of the toilets under them for maintenance. And the petition was put forth by a bunch of private actors. At which point the MCD says, I mean, the court says, okay, great, I can deal with this issue as long as I know how many toilets I'm dealing with. So there's this huge back and forth that happens because there's absolute confusion at that point in time. And then the court notes it in its judgment. And finally, at the end of which, MCD provides a split of who owns what. The MCD is the Municipal Corporation of Delhi in this case. And then there's this interesting situation where the confusion continues. So you have an RTI petition filed by a woman called Vandana, who lives in Jagdamba camp, which is also a Juggi Jhopdi cluster, with the simple question: who owns and runs the toilet in my basti? And no surprise, MCD does not return a reply even. Of course, this goes up to the Central Information Commissioner, which tells you that, I mean, there was a much back and forth. And the Central Information Commissioner then just demands a reply. He says, tell me what the split is. And MCD finally finds out that within 8 zones, there are 12 zones in Delhi. And 8 zones are with the MCD, 4 with private contractors. And within those 12 zones, 152 of them are with the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board, and these are in slum areas. So I think this speaks to the point that, in fact, the Central Information Commissioner then goes on to say that only so that grievance redressal is actually possible, that you can go complain to someone saying the community toilet complex within my basti does not work. You have to now put up on the walls of the community toilet complex who owns the basti, who owns the community toilet complex, who is the grievance redressal officer, and says this is now law. They have to do it so that you can prevent this back and forth from continuing. Now, going back to the point about decentralization, it's interesting because you notice that there are so many agencies involved, and over time there is no doubt that the state government of Delhi has diluted the powers of the Municipal Corporation of Delhi. And how they have done this is actually present in the situation that I just spoke about. So earlier the Municipal Corporation of Delhi used to be in charge of providing services to slum areas. They created an agency called the Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board at the state level, which took away those powers. And this confusion sort of continues till date. So.
Yeah, and in many ways, I often have this sense when you think about all the schemes that are in place designed to improve access, it's like the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. So I think for some comparative experiences in Mumbai, Ramnath is going to share.
Well, I think that's such a great lead-in, that last. I think the issue in urban areas with sanitation is less one of demand, especially just because it's awful, especially for women, but also for men to be defecating in the open. It's criminalized. Men are arrested. I mean, it's not pleasant by any means. Open defecation is not in this beautiful field and in sort of a Bollywood movie, as it might be in rural areas, or at least that's maybe how it's envisioned. But it's an issue of conflicting stakeholders. There's so many stakeholders. There are a lot of conflicts. There's a lot of legal confusion. And what happens in situations where no one knows whose toilet it is that the toilet runs down very rapidly, because usually there are just huge overpopulation per toilet seat. I mean, you have 1,000 people per toilet seat, right? I mean, just in terms of the number of people per toilet seat, in big block toilets that run down and become dumps. And this is sort of an example of that. And I'm actually not going to present work from Kalabandar, but of one of the sort of major organizations in India that works in slum settlements, National Slum Dwellers Federation, and SPARC, maybe known to others internationally, Slum Dwellers International. This was one of the major founding members of that. And the SPARC, National Slum Dweller Federation model was that these toilets run down because there's no clear idea of who the stakeholders are and who has the responsibility of maintaining it, or even if that's known, no one maintains it, even knowing who that person might be. And so their idea was to build a set of community designed, community built, and community managed toilets. Community designed so that it addresses, for example, women's needs and how it's structured so that they have privacy that's appropriate to them, and to address children's needs, who are largely unaddressed in sort of your normal toilets. It's community built. Oftentimes women were the contractors for building these toilets, and community managed. From the late 19th, and community management that and this is probably the most important part, the community creates a pact, they hire a manager, that manager has a role in running, managing, making sure the toilet's clean, and he's to some extent paid by the community. So this was sort of the SPARC model of community block toilets, and they built at least 320 of these, to my understanding, from the late 1990s until the mid-2000s. And this is sort of an example of what the toilets symbolize. This is from Arjun Appadurai, who's an anthropologist, writing about the SPARC model in sort of a very evocative terms. The fact remains that rural defecation is managed through a completely different economy of space, water, visibility, and custom from that prevailing in cities, where the problem is much more serious. Defecating in public is a serious humiliation for adults. At the few existing public toilets, the lines are often so long that they involve waiting times of an hour or more. In short, defecating and its management are a central issue of slum life. The toilet festivals, and these are sort of model toilets built by SPARC when they were seeking funding. The toilet festivals organized by the SPARC and NSDF are a brilliant effort to resituate this private act of humiliation and suffering as a scene of technical innovation, collective celebration, and carnivalesque play with officials from the state, the World Bank, and middle-class officialdom. The toilet festivals feature the exhibition and inauguration not of models, but of functioning public toilets, designed by and for the poor, incorporating complex systems of collective payment and maintenance, with optimal conditions of safety and cleanliness. The politics of shit is turned on its head, and humiliation and victimization are transformed into exercises in technical initiative and self-dignification. This is sort of a grand vision of what a toilet could represent, mean, and be, and how it could be formed and how it could be central to a community. And these are some examples of SPARC toilets that were built in this era. So one thing you'll notice, they're huge. I mean, these Bombay's slum settlements are arguably the densest human settlements that exist. These take up substantial space in the community. They're oftentimes the largest building. The second story is often used as a school or for other public purposes. These are relatively large aggregates of toilet seats. This is another example. So I'm just providing this as an example. I do want to put out that there, in full disclosure, I interned with SPARC in the early 2000s for 2 summers. But there are critiques of the SPARC toilets out there, especially now that we're sort of entering the post-SPARC era in Mumbai. For one, I think there are concerns that communities don't speak with a single voice. And so there's the potential, and some would argue that this may have happened in some cases, that subsections of the community can be marginalized. If a community has to get together to decide who has a stake in the toilet and who doesn't, who has to pay in, if people don't pay in, how are all of those things negotiated? And so on the one hand, this is a good thing. On the one hand, one could see that this could create a lot of conflict and exclusion in the worst case scenarios. Maintenance of toilets is still difficult. Toilets run down slowly, but still run down. And also NGOs are taking over roles that government should be performing. This is sort of a major concern that, well, then if NGOs are building and managing and running the toilets, where's the government? What's their role? Why are we abdicating the space that the government has a responsibility to perform in? This is a sort of toilet that Rahul Mehrotra designed for SPARC that was built in a community. You can see it sort of hovers over. And this is an example of how the upper story could be a community space. Anyways, I'll sort of end with that so we can have some discussion time.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, I think one of the things that at least some of the reports that I've read, both in urban areas and rural areas, is the critical importance of involving women in some of these decision making. In rural areas, often relying on self-help groups. There's a great report by Dasra in Urban Slums that was talking about that when women were involved in the decision making and planning processes, toilets tended to be run more effectively and in the long run. So we've sort of taken, we're about to open it up to you guys. We've taken you through sort of a huge tour of sanitation in India, right? Starting with the global perspective, moving through to the public health perspective, thinking about what it's like for life in the JJCs. From there, the impacts of water scarcity on lack of toilets, the huge central government schemes in rural and urban areas, and then the real challenges of a kind of who owns what, who's responsible for what. And I think that this question of women and the disproportionate burden that lack of toilets bears is kind of a thread that goes throughout all of them.